Welcome to December 2021 Inntopia DestiMetrics 5 Things You Need to Know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the headlines. So having done a bit of research for our Mountain Travel News newsletter that went out yesterday, just picked out some of the more interesting or more germane topics that are out there in the ski industry. Vail Resorts, I know we've talked about this before, but I just find this to be quite a staggering number about the increase in season pass and ticket sales. A 76% increase over 2 years ago, which is about almost 1 million more tickets and passes purchased in advance. So that is a good indicator of demand, that's for sure, for the upcoming season. Also, this article in the top left, it's How to Save a Ski Town, that was written by Outside Magazine, which is a really in-depth look at housing crisis and workforce shortages in mountain towns, and focuses a bit on Crested Butte, but some really good nuggets of information of what people are doing to find solutions. Snowfall, that's top of mind. It's been pretty dry throughout the Western United States. We've got some smatterings of storms here and there, and happy to report that Tahoe in particular got dumped down with several feet of snow, and it looks like by this weekend all those resorts will be open. Colorado, Utah, etc. are still kind of chugging along. And then this 3 myths of the Great Resignation, I'm going to send that link along too, because that has some qualification around what that means. That term Great Resignation has been thrown around a lot, but is it really quitting? It's really more about trading up and people trying to take advantage of open job positions that kind of move them up the chain. And then of course Omicron and what's going on with international travel as more travel restrictions come into play and border closures. So, and Tom's going to talk a little bit about that. So anyway, that's number 1, and then over to Tom for number 2.
Thank you very much, Katie. I am really interested in the Great Resignation and really the sort of the free agency take in that article. It's worth reading for those that might be interested. Also very interested in what's going to happen with border restrictions in Canada. But I'm on to number 2. Number 2 is January dip in bookings that we're seeing. Immediately following what is a really strong December, we see this huge drop in bookings in early January. And really that's directly related to what's going on with K-12 students and when their breaks fall. K-12 students' vacations extended through the weekend of the 9th in the 18-19 season, but also in the 17-18 season, the 16-17 season. And this year, they're almost all back in school and in class by the 5th of the month. In fact, most of them are back in class by January 3rd. So school breaks have a huge influence on travel decisions. College breaks, not so much. We talked about this a little bit, and there was a piece that we put out a little while ago, but it's really worth monitoring because people have been, contacting me and saying, is there anything we can do about this dip that we see in January? And, unless you've got a way to figure out how to deal with school that's happening in person, not really. It's really difficult to overcome. So always keep an eye on school breaks and school calendars and what's going on with those, and we have the way to help you with that and don't need to get into it. Number 3 on our top 5 is going to involve asking you some poll questions as well. So I'll ask Stacy to stand by to launch those. But first of all, there's a lot of lift line chatter going on out there. There's a lot of limited terrain because of the snowfall issues, though that's happily going to get better. And yet, we seem to be seeing happy skiers. Most resorts do have limited terrain. Skiers are definitely flocking to the slopes, and some of the pictures we see are of some very long lines. And this is a recipe for disaster. From what I've heard in the phone calls I've made and the conversations I've had, visitors seem to be enjoying the chance to just get out and ski. They do recognize things could be worse. They do like the fact that there is not a reservation system, which was in play at this time last year. Locals, on the other hand, might feel a little bit differently about it. They go to get some early tracks and find that there's a pretty long lineup in place there to get onto that limited terrain. So that's a bit more of a challenge. And of course, it's not really clear whether these lift lines are increased skier volume over typical seasons, if it's the decrease in terrain or if it's a little combination of both. So let's start out by just going through a few polls to get a sense from the people who are on this call about what's going on locally for you and what you're seeing. And the first poll we want to launch is to ask what % of your local terrain is open. So you should see that up on your screen. If you take a look at that and just take a moment to respond, that'll be helpful. We'll leave it open for as long as Stacy deems it necessary to do so, probably about 30 seconds. But we're curious, it obviously varies, and the answer you give today might be quite different from what you would have given 3 or 4 days ago, given some of the weather that blew through in the last 72 hours. So Stacy, how are we doing? Do we have some results we can look at?
We do. Let me go ahead and display those for you guys.
Outstanding. So it looks like about 25% of terrain open is dominant, with 50 the next dominant, and then 75 the most. Nobody's got none. That's good. Nobody's got 100 either, which is, of course, we are early-ish in the season, not as early as we were last time we had conversations about this, but clearly there's a terrain issue out there. So thanks for your responses to that. We're going to go straight in and just launch another one. And the question really is, what is your sense of the number of skier days that are being experienced, or skier volume? So are we looking at it being up sharply? Are we looking at it being up somewhat, neutral, down sharply, and down somewhat? And this would be compared to the same relative period last year, or because last year was anomalous, maybe 2 years ago, or typically. So it's just a sense. There's nothing really scientific about this. But take a minute to respond to that. And I'm guessing that's going to be widely varied depending upon where you are and how you've managed to do snowfall-wise, or snowmaking-wise, for that matter, with all that investment out there. And Stacy, let me know when you're ready and go for it.
Yep, it looks like results are still coming in. I'm going to give it just another couple of seconds here.
Sure. I'm happy to have some dead air for a moment. It's okay. So up sharply, which is outstanding to see, and up somewhat neutral. There's really, there are some that are down actually somewhat, and down sharply. Down sharply is now none, down somewhat. But for the most part, looks like people are, at least from what they can tell, are thinking that it is up considerably. And I guess it comes down to, how do you get that perception? Is it by volume in town? Is it by the length of the lift lines, which might be impacted by the terrain thing? Or is it just your experience on the hill? Because the hill itself is crowded. That has little to do with, well, it's got a lot to do with terrain, less to do with lift lines. So the one more we wanted to get is if you're experiencing any feedback from the guests that are coming to stay with you, and what kind of feedback you're getting. Is it very positive? Is it somewhat positive? Is it neutral, somewhat negative, or very negative? And this just goes down to what we think, what do we think the experience might be that they're having given the conditions of lower terrain and what seems to be higher volume. It'd be interesting to see if this lines up with the anecdotal information that I've been gathering over the last couple of days, which was really pretty positive from the visitors, not so much from the locals. I'll give that just a moment.
Yep.
All set?
Yep, we should be all set now.
So somewhat positive, neutral, somewhat negative. It looks like it's really sitting right in the middle ground, but mostly towards the positive, which is good to hear. So, kind of the nutshell is, there are long lines and there is limited terrain. Skiers, it sounds like, are leaning towards the positive. At least that's what we're getting from you folks and what your experience is. So that's good to hear. So thank you, Stacy, for conducting those, and we'll move on out of our number 3 and into our number 4 of our 5 things you need to know. And the first is that bookings continue to be guided by COVID. And we've talked about this a bit in past webinars. Consumers are responding to increases in cases. Omicron is expected to double every 3 days over the course of the next while. It's expected to be dominant in many of the Western countries in the next while as well. So what, right? Consumers, however, the so what is that consumers do remain sensitive to new infection rates, contrary to sort of non-measured perception where people say everybody's out doing anything they want whenever they want. That's just not true. And that's borne out by the chart that we see here on the left, where we're looking at booking volume changes in the black line, and caseload, new cases, in the orange line. This is bookings through the Inntopia system for reservations in mountain resorts at our 1,700 mountain partners. So that's a pretty big correlation. There's a real inverse proportional relationship between these two things. And decreases in booking volume now might complicate the January to April part of the season. The early part of the season is really benefiting from long lead, strong bookings for November and December. And if we see a drop off in that foundational booking pattern for January through April and continue to have poor snow, it actually could work against us. So we'll hope that that Omicron and Delta and COVID in general settles down a little bit so that consumers can return back to those really positive numbers that we've seen. And lastly, a 3-year comparison, because a few years ago was actually the all-time record winter. But this is just looking at the DestiMetrics data, looking at occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR. On the first row, we're looking at versus last year. No surprises there. We've talked about that a lot. Up 74% on occupancy, 30% on rate, 125% on revenue. And of course, that's the way it's going to be, given how last year went at this time in advanced bookings and big surges going on. Versus 1920, up 11%, 29%, and 43%, respectively. And versus 1819, up 8%, 33%, and 43%. So it is very, very strong in the long-term context, and that is largely due to this huge amount of volume that we saw booking that was reservation demand pushed from late summer, but also a lot of transactional stuff that's taken place over the last 60 days.